Great. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us here. My name is James Fallows. I'm a writer for The Atlantic, and I'm delighted to be here for this session. You all, as am I, are eager to hear the thoughts of Robert Putnam, which we'll explore over the next hour with times for questions from all of you. The film we just saw about somebody trying to make a difference in her school and her community is connected to the panel that immediately preceded this one about the sort of civic institutions that allow people to take part in or exclude them from society. And all this makes Robert Putnam the ideal speaker to be having at this stage of the program. You all, how many people have read any books by Robert Putnam? How many people have, I won't say all books, how many has read his latest book, Our Kids? How many people read the one before that, Bowling Alone? How many people have not heard of the term bowling alone and its connotations? Well, so there is some explanatory work you can do here, but that's a mark of having changed the public discourse, of having people recognize a term you've used. Robert Putnam is, of course, a professor at Harvard of government. The books of his I want to mention. I'm going to mention one that precedes both Bowling Alone and Our Kids. That's one called Making Democracy Work, Civic Traditions in Modern Italy. That came out in 93, 94, sometime around then. Right. What was fascinating to me about that book was something that's been a trademark of Professor Putnam's work both before and after that, which is looking at the parts of society we normally write about and concentrate on. That is, on the one hand, business, economics, getting and spending, rising and falling trends. On the other, political structure, elections, who has power, how power is shared or not. And he's looked for the connective fiber of the civic fabric that makes both of those parts of society work better or work worse, and what kind of civic structure you need to make democracy in particular viable in the long run. That was a big theme of Bowling Alone, which first as an article in the Journal of Democracy, I think, right, and then as a book, changed the discussion. Its argument being essentially that people were having, as Tocqueville had looked at the associative qualities of America, of people liking to form groups, there was less and less of that, the book argued, and therefore the kinds of informal bonds that made America work were being strained. And we see an extension of that with Our Kids, which argues, as we'll hear in a moment, that further pressure on civic structure and economic situations has made it harder for the American essence of mobility, equity, small d democracy, and the large D American dream to work. My plan for the next while is to spend first some time talking about this book. I know many of you have read it, but you probably haven't heard from the author, so we'll explore some of the twists in the arguments. I will even have some minor challenges to part of the argument. Then I'd like to talk about some of the larger situation of American society at this stage in history. Many people have commented that we're in a second Gilded Age, and we know that the first Gilded Age led to some kind of reforms, and we will talk about the prospects for America in that situation. Then we're going to talk about some to-dos. There's a impressively practical-minded list of steps that Professor Putnam has at the end of the book. And you've taken exception to the idea that your book is pessimistic. Is that right?
Oh, yeah. I think it lays out a serious problem, but I'd like to convince people this is a really serious problem, but secondly, I think we can go about fixing it, and that's what we can talk about here.
And that's what we'll end on, then we'll have time for questions from the audience. So, stipulating that your book has been well covered over the last couple of months and that many people here have read it, would you distill the essence of what you were arguing from your casework in Bend, Oregon, where you've also been in the Philadelphia suburbs, in Orange County, California, near where I grew up, and Port Clinton, Ohio, where you grew up, and near where my wife grew up, and Atlanta and elsewhere, the distilled version of how you would like people to change their minds about American society right now?
Thanks very much, and thanks to all of you for coming. Let me start at the 30,000-foot level. There are big trends that have happened in America over the last 30 or 40 years. The first is the one that's been talked about repeatedly here at this Ideas Festival, the growing income gap between rich folks and poor folks. I'm not going to say anything about that. It's very important, but since there's been lots of discussion of it, I won't add to that discussion. A second big trend from 30,000 feet that's very important, but is actually much less appreciated outside scholars, is that at the same time there's been this growing income gap in America, there's also been increasing segregation within American society along class lines. Segregation in America has not increased along all lines of division. Along some lines of division, we're a much less segregated society than we used to. We're certainly in religious terms, for example, a less segregated society. Even in racial terms, we're a somewhat less segregated society. Of course, we still have a lot of work to do there, but racially, in racial terms, where we live, whom we marry, who we go to school with, there's been some movement toward greater integration. But in social class terms, on all these measures, there's been a sharp increase in segregation. We are much less likely now to live near people who have different incomes or different educational levels from us than we used to be. So we're increasingly living in either rich enclaves or poor enclaves, and many fewer of us now than even 20 or 30 years ago are living in mixed income neighborhoods or moderate income neighborhoods. That's in terms of where we live, but you can see the same general pattern of increasing segregation in terms of who our kids go to school with. Increasingly, affluent kids are going to school with other affluent kids, poor kids are going to school with other poor kids, and that has powerful implications for the kind of education they're getting, and indeed powerful implications for the degree to which people even know each other across social class lines. One of the most striking indicators of the growing segregation in American society is that although intermarriage across religious and racial lines has been obviously increasing a lot over these 30 years, intermarriage across social class lines has been decreasing a lot over these years. We're less likely now than we used to be to marry someone who comes from a different socioeconomic background or has a different educational level. Intermarriage is actually a kind of a neat sociological indicator, mainly because we generally don't marry people that we have not met. And so intermarriage rates, like, for example, the fact that racial intermarriage rates are up reflects the fact that people in their marriageable years are increasingly likely to encounter people of a different race, even more so of a different religion. And conversely, the fact that interclass marriage has declined is a silent but powerful indicator of the fact that people in their teens and 20s and 30s are less likely now than they used to be to encounter someone from a different class background. Third big macro trend is that there's there's a really quite dramatic collapse, I would say, of bonds of family and community in what we used to call working class neighborhoods across America. I'm interested in the implications of those three big trends for our kids. What difference does it make for our kids growing up that they are increasingly surrounded by other kids like them, that is, like them if they're rich or like them if they're poor? What difference does it make that there's this growing income gap and growing segregation and the growing collapse of the working class family? And the book has a lot of stories, as you say, including some in Bend, or my hometown of Port Clinton, that we can talk about. But the analytic core of the book is a series of what we call scissors graphs, which chart, over the last roughly 30 years, increasing divergence between kids coming from affluent or college-educated backgrounds and kids coming from impoverished or high school-educated backgrounds on a lot of measures of the opportunities and resources available to rich kids and poor kids. For example, the amount of money that parents spend on enrichment of their kids' lives. Think of that as measure of social summer camp activities or piano lessons or computer games, all those things. That the amount of money that rich families or affluent families are spending on their kids has gone up a lot over these years. The amount of money on the same measures that poor families are able to spend has been steady or even declining, so there's a growing gap there. There's a similar growing gap in the amount of time that parents spend with their kids, especially young kids, in reading and playing pat a cake and all the other kinds of developmental activities. We call that the good night moon gap, and the good night moon gap has grown a lot. It used to be there was no difference between working class and affluent families in the amount of time parents spent reading to them and playing with them, but now there's every 45-minute-a-day gap in the difference between kids in college-educated homes and kids in high school in less educated homes. A similar gap, and I'm going to try to be quick here just listing the variables, but what they show is this comprehensive picture. Similar gap in test scores. Test scores in school are up for affluent kids and not up for working class kids. And this is true across all races. This is not just a matter of race, it's a matter of socioeconomic class. Similar gap in the amount of social support kids get from from their neighbors and community institutions, a gap in church attendance, for example. Actually, that gap looks this way. All kids are less likely to go to church now than they used to be, but the decline has been concentrated among poor kids. And that's an interesting marker of the most important thing that we learn from all these conversations with kids, rich kids and poor kids across America, which is that poor kids in America, compared to poor kids 30 years ago, are increasingly isolated from all of the major institutions of society and from people, other people in society. So they're increasingly living alone. They're not connected as much as they used to be, and as much as affluent kids are, to schools, to their parents because their families are in turmoil, to churches, to schools, to neighbors, to peers. And that fact is most painfully manifested in the fact that there's a growing level of alienation and cynicism and distrust among these working class kids that had no parallel 30, 40 years ago. One of the kids we interviewed in Port Clinton, my hometown, a poor kid in Port Clinton now, recently, her pseudonym is Mary Sue. Mary Sue recently posted on Facebook, "Love hurts, trust kills." Think about what it means to grow up in a world in which you cannot trust anybody. Don't even trust your own family, baby, one of the people that we talked to said. And this, I'm trying to make this real in our own personal experience. All kids do dumb things. Rich kids, poor kids, black kids, white kids, brown kids, your kids, my kids, all kids do dumb things. One of my grandchildren is sitting here in the audience, and he is the one exception in America. All of our kids do dumb things. When a kid coming from an affluent, well-educated home does a dumb thing, they drink too much, or they get involved with drugs, or they make a stupid decision in their romantic life, or they get in a fight with a teacher, or they back the car into the next door neighbor's garage, or whatever. In upper class or upper middle class families in America, instantly airbags inflate to protect the kid from the worst consequences of that dumb decision. You call the best lawyer in town, or you find the best rehab facility in the state, or whatever. And that's fine, and I'm not objecting to that. If that happened to one of my grandchildren, that's the same thing I'd want to do. You would too. But what I'm asking you to think about is that poor kids in America increasingly don't have any airbags. So if they do exactly the same dumb thing, no learning opportunity, what they're stuck with is the permanent results of that dumb decision. That's the core idea of this book, that there's this growing income gap. We can talk about why it happened. I think there are a lot of reasons why it happened. We can talk about what we might do to narrow the opportunity gap. It's important. One thing I want to spend just a second on is, why should people on the upside of the opportunity gap worry about kids on the downside of the opportunity gap? Partly it is, if you read the stories in the book about poor kids, I think almost everybody who's read those stories thinks this is just morally wrong. These kids shouldn't be living these isolated, dead-end lives in America. But it's not only that, it's also in our self-interest, and I'm speaking myself now as one of these, and can I see the hands of everybody in the room who has a college education? So when I say rich, you're who I mean. I'm not talking about Bill Gates, I'm just talking about the upper third of American society, that is college-educated Americans. Why should we care about poor kids? And the answer is not just how it violates the American dream, it also has bad consequences for our children and grandchildren, because this is not a zero-sum game. If we invest in many ways, I don't just mean financially, but if we invest in poor kids, things will be better for our kids too. The cost to the whole society of a generation of roughly 25 million poor kids in America are estimated by economists at roughly, over their lifetime, roughly $5 trillion. Part of that is, as the previous panel discussed, part of that is because of the criminal justice system. These kids get in trouble, and the criminal justice system has to deal with that. A larger part is the healthcare cost, because these kids are on a track that will lead them almost inevitably to get sicker, earlier, longer, and worse. And somebody's going to have to pay for that those healthcare costs, and it's going to be us. But the third and most important reason why it's in our interest to help those poor kids is our economy will grow more rapidly if we make use of the talents that are currently not being used because these poor kids are not put in a position to advance. So I think this is a big, important problem. I'm actually optimistic. We can talk later about why I'm optimistic. But the first thing I have to say is this is a big deal. It's a big deal because we are moving, and I'm sorry to use this hyperbolic language, we're moving toward an America that none of us have ever lived in which being affluent or being poor is inherited. That the most important decision that any kid makes is choosing their parents. And America has not been that way in the past. We've had, of course, great inequalities in America in the past, but we've never been quite, with the important exception of the racial dimensions of inequality in America, we've never quite lived in a society like this. It's not what America was founded about, and I think it's going to be really bad for our own kids on the upside of the opportunity gap if we don't begin to fix this.
There are many things I'd like to ask about here. I'm going to pick my opportunities. One I'll say is that connecting the previous panel and this one, the strongest single message I've gotten from all the things I've heard over the past few days has been the damage done to particular Americans and America as well by the incarceration boom. The fact that there's so many more people in jail, so many of them are minorities, and they have no chance once they get out. And so This is a part of your argument. I'll try to rebuild my faith in your power as a social observer after you're describing this room as the upper 1/3 of America. So that was, the Aspen has been higher than that. But
no, of course.
Yes,
I didn't mean to dismiss you. Of course, you're well above the 33rd percentile.
Yes, there is an important point you made in the end about we've never seen this before. Many of the comparisons you use in the book trace back to your boyhood in the 40s and 50s in Ohio and 60s and after that. I recognize that with my own boyhood in 50s and 60s Southern California. And compared to exactly what are you making this question? Certainly compared to the Ozzie and Harriet, Happy Days type era, we can say there's been a fall from grace then, but that excludes obviously the opportunities for racial minorities then, for women, the sort of Mad Men plus and minus. In the long sweep of American history, are you saying this is a decline from what the U.S. has been over its entirety, or decline from that post-World War II special era?
Well, there are many questions there. The first thing, of course, to say, and I do say this at some length, I actually spend more time on this than anything else in the first chapter when I'm talking about poor Clinton. That era, the 50s and 60s, was obviously an era of racism in many, many forms, very virulent and sometimes a little more subtle racism. And of course, there was a glass ceiling in gender terms. And that was true in Port Clinton. And I talk about that. But in social class terms, we now know in Port Clinton, because I've interviewed all of my surviving classmates of the class of 1959, but we know the same thing is true nationwide. In social class terms, kids growing up in that era, from the right side of the tracks and the wrong side of the tracks, all had a decent chance. 80% of my classmates, this is a little town. It's 40% of our parents had not graduated from high school. So this is a quite modest town. No very rich people, no very poor people. But the kids from the wrong side of the tracks have done, it turns out, just about as well as the kids from the right side of the tracks. The two black kids in my class who were very talented and very hardworking, but they were living in the 50s in a mostly white town. Nobody in their homes had ever gone past 3rd grade. Both of them graduated from high school, big deal. Both of them got fellowships to go to college. Both of them graduated from college. Both of them went to graduate school. Both of them got graduate degrees, and both of them had very successful professional careers. I'm not using that episode to say there wasn't racism. Of course there was racism in town, but despite the racism, there was not the class barriers in that period. Now, and there has been a real change. The stories I tell about that change. The anecdotes that you and I could share about that period illustrate that change. But the data show that that's true too. And that's what all these scissors graphs are about. I'm not just picking, cherry picking sob stories when I talk about the fate of poor kids in America today. The data show what I'm describing, which is that the opportunities open to and the challenges facing these poor kids have changed in a very bad way over the last 30 or 40 years. Now, I'm not saying that there's never been a period in American history when we haven't faced a problem like that. And indeed, maybe later we can talk about the course of the 20th century, which was a very interesting, the sociological and economic patterns traced in America over the 20th century are very interesting. But, you know, we're here now trying to figure out how to make America better.
So I'm going to ask you one more causation question, then we might move to some of the solutions. You have chapters that are on changes in family structure and changes in school equality and in community fabric and all the rest. And from your point of view, is there a prime mover in this cycle, or is it all one syndrome that you can't separate?
Well, the big background factors are the ones that I've already mentioned at the outset. That's why I mentioned them. That is, part of the change that's gone on is this growing economic inequality in the incomes of the families. Another big part of it is the growing segregation of American families.
But is one causing the other, or they all are just coinciding?
So, well, they're coinciding, and there's mutual causation between the two of them. I think actually the biggest underlying cause, and this is why the book is titled as it is, in an era when you and I were growing up, in Port Clinton, when my parents talked about doing things for our kids, when they said, you know, we've got to pay higher taxes so our kids can have a swimming pool at the high school, or, you know, a French department or whatever. When my parents and people like them across America used in that era the term our kids, they meant all the kids in town. They didn't just mean my sister and me. And the evidence of that is my parents and other people in Port Clinton kept on taxing themselves to pay for other people's kids, even when my sister and I were long gone. But what's happened over the last 30 or 40 years, and this is the bowling alone story, this is a connection between bowling alone and this book, is that there's been a shriveling of our sense of connection with other people, a shriveling of what we mean when we say our kids. So if you talk to people now about when people say my kids are doing fine, they don't mean the people in town, they mean their own biological kids. And that shriveling of our sense of obligation to all the kids in America, all the kids in town, that's, I think, the underlying driver, and that actually is, you can track that change across the 20th century, rising, becoming more egalitarian and more communitarian in the first part of the 20th century, and then in the late 60s, early 70s, all of those trends reversed, and we've become less egalitarian and less concerned about other people than we were in the earlier period.
Let me lay on the table as a subject for later discussion over beers between you and me and over the years ahead. As my wife Deb and I have been traveling around the country in the past 2 years, we've seen the opposite trend. We've seen community after community where they've raised taxes to have better schools for our kids, where refugees from Somalia are being incorporated. And so there is certainly a long-term historic shift that you have very ably chronicled. I'm saying if you came with us on some of these visits, you might have a more positive sense of people reacting to these trends in a way that you would welcome.
But we're close friends. But I'm now about to disagree. And I hope I'm not disagreeable. It happens that one of the towns that you and your wife visited and wrote about just last week or 2 weeks ago.
I have a bunch more to come.
Is Bend, Oregon.
Yep.
And it happens Bend, Oregon is one of the places we did our research. And so you can tell folks your impression of Bend. You've just described it. It's a very civic and growing community and so on. And I just want to briefly tell you about two people that we interviewed there. We interviewed lots of people, but two people we interviewed. One is Andrew. Andrew is he's now just about to graduate from college. He's the son of an affluent, self-made family. You've got to know that Bend sits on a river, and it's divided by the river, and the west bank of the river is hills that go up to the Cascade Mountains, and that's very affluent. And the right side of the right side, if you're looking at a map, the east side of the river is basically arid high desert, and if you physically look there, there's mansions on the west side of the river and dilapidated double wides on the right side of the river. Andrew lives on the affluent side of the river. He attended Summit High School, which is also over there on the affluent side. In his census tract, there is 5. And I've got because I knew we were going to be talking, I've looked at this morning at the latest data. Child poverty rate on that side of town is 5%. 5% of the kids there are living in poverty. And Summit High School that he attended, and that you probably at least passed by over there on the West Bank, has a high school dropout rate of 15%. And Andrew said, and I'm now quoting from the book actually, Bend is a small community and you don't see a whole lot of poverty in Bend. But now I want to take you across the river just briefly to the other side of the river and have you meet Kayla. Kayla is a woman that we talked to. We talked to a lot of kids from that side of the river too. Kayla is the daughter of a very unstable working class family. She's only 10 minutes away lives only 10 minutes away from Andrew. In her census tract, today, the child poverty rate is 44%. That's not an affluent Bend. That's the other Bend. And she attended Marshall High School, which is on the east side of the river, where the high school dropout rate is 50%, 50%. And those two kids, Andrew and Kayla, although they're living in Bend, and Bend institutionally looks as what you've described, they are living completely different lives. And one reason I think why the people in the institutions of Bend, like the community college, are simply unaware, effectively, of the poverty. Local social workers are not unaware of it. They call it poverty with a view because it's a very nice place, but there's deep, deep poverty there. That is a completely different Bend. And so here's the question. I don't know, Jim, I can tell you how we formed our impression.
And how long were you personally there?
I was personally there just briefly, but my team was there for going on a month and talking to lots and lots of kids. And so Andrew says there's no poverty in Bend. Kayla says, and I'm not going to read the whole account, but Kayla said she kind of hoped, when we talked to her, she hoped she was going to the community college, the very same community college. It turns out, now, I've checked on this morning, it didn't work out for her. She was not able to get her act together to enjoy the community college. When we talked to her, she was confronted with all these challenges she's faced. She has one great fear, having my life go downhill, everything kind of falling apart. Do you think that might happen? I feel like it is happening, she said, even though at the point we talked to her, she had a fellowship to go to this community college. What do you think will happen, we said? Well, like college isn't going to go through, or my grants ain't going to go through, or then my family's getting sick. We then said, have you ever had a time when you just felt like you couldn't make it? A lot, actually, she said. And Kayla and Jared and the other people that we talked to are living in the same town, but they're not.
Yes, and we probably don't. Each institution has its sources of professional pride, and for journalists, it involves being there and seeing things. And in the travels we've done around the country, we've been to a lot of places that we chose because they had problems. San Bernardino, California, the most difficult city in California, very near where I grew up. Bend, more importantly, the Prineville and Redmond areas were the real problems. That's not the east side of Bend, it's Prineville and Redmond that have the,
both, actually.
I will assert to you. The question is how the community institutions are dealing with those issues. And the Central Oregon Community College is unusual because it's an area that has no four-year university. And it's a place they've raised like this giant foundations for fellowships, like the one you were describing. So people have hard lives every place, and that is true. And you've chronicled it, and we've chronicled it, and it's how institutions are responding. That's what's been of interest to us.
Look, I think that community colleges, in principle, could be part of the solution here. So I'm not in the business here of attacking community colleges, quite the contrary. And I don't mean to spring a question on you. Do you know what the dropout rate across American community colleges is? I don't know what it is at that community college. Do you know what
I don't know what it is, but I'll tell you before you tell me what it is. That in East Mississippi Community College in the Golden Triangle of Mississippi, we've seen people who have been taken off welfare and from the penal institutions for jobs, for high-wage factory jobs. In Maine, we've seen the colleges train people for maritime jobs. We've seen Greenville, South Carolina, people being trained for auto industry jobs. So I don't know what the rate is. I know that I've seen ones that are trying to adapt to a different circumstance.
Yeah, that's great, but actually the facts matter.
Yes, I agree.
And the nation, the aspirations are great, and I'm all in favor of working to try to improve community colleges, but across the country, the dropout rate from community colleges, that is the fraction of all kids who enter community colleges who exit without anything, without a 2-year degree, without a 4-year degree, without anything, is about 70%, 70%. And so, at least, look, when I was a dean, I interacted with management consultants, and I learned that the most important thing to say is never talk about a problem. Talk about improvement opportunities. And so, can we agree at least that this is an improvement opportunity?
Yes, and that's what, and so improvement opportunities in vocational education and community college have been of great interest to us.
Yeah.
Let's talk an area where we are more likely to, actually, I think we have complementary perspectives on the same issue. We've been looking for places that have problems and what they're doing about them. We didn't come to Aspen on our tour.
Yeah, but actually, if you had come to Aspen, you would have discovered in this area there are 2 Aspens.
Well,
there's an Aspen that we all, that hill is one Aspen, and things are great. But there's another Aspen out there.
And the people in Bend, one of their things they were trying to do with their growth management was to avoid the another Aspen phenomenon, where people who work there couldn't afford to live there.
But Jim, right there in Bend now, only 5 minutes on the other side of the river, the child poverty rate in those census tracts is 44%. It's 40% 3 years ago, and it's 44% now. That's a lot of kids.
It was even worse 10 years ago when the unemployment rate there was 15%, as after anyhow. So let us talk about Gilded Ageism.
Yep.
If it is, I have asserted that if the problems of this time are like the first Gilded Age, now in our second Gilded Age, we should look to the phenomenal wave of reform that succeeded that. Say, are there lessons that can be inferred from that? What is your thought on that theme?
In real life, I'm a professor, and I don't want to spend 50 minutes telling you about a different research project, but I want to try very quickly to describe something. We've actually not published this yet, so you're all in on the early stages of this. I want to describe quickly trends in the United States over the 20th century, beginning in 1900, that's going to be here, and ending in 2000, that's going to be here. First of all, what were the trends in America over the 20th century with respect to income equality? You all know what this graph looks like. You've seen it the other way around. You've seen trends in income inequality. That's the Piketty graph. I'm just flipping that graph over, and that graph looks like this. Beginning in low equality or high inequality in the Gilded Age, rising up till about, that graph turns about 1970 and then begins to decline, and now we're back in another Golden Age. That's income inequality. Okay, erase that graph. I'm going to show you the graph, pardon me, of inequality in wealth over the 20th century. It begins with high equality of wealth, right? So it begins with high inequality, low equality of wealth. It goes like that. Almost the same graph. Now let's shift areas. I'm going to talk about the trends in social capital, social connectedness. This is a chart that actually appears in Bowling Alone based on people's degree to which they join community institutions. That graph looks like that. If you've been looking carefully, it looks pretty similar. Now let's have the graph of altruism, the fraction of our income that we give away, personal income that we give away, and that graph over the course of the 20th century looks like that. Now let's look at the graph of the degree to which people cooperate across party lines. This is it's a measure of the absence of political polarization. So cooperation across party lines looks like that. If this is beginning to look familiar, it's familiar. It's right. There are other graphs that I could describe like that. One last one is inter-class marriage, the rate at which people marry people from some class other than their own, and that graph looks like that. Those graphs, if I had a PowerPoint here, they look almost indistinguishable, even though they are very different aspects of American society. Who we marry, how much money we give away, the degree of income inequality, the degree to which our politics is polarized, the degree to which we connect with other people, and so on. Now, there are a lot of questions about that chart. The first is, what causes all that? I don't know for sure. One thing I can say for sure is it's not the economic variables, because economic inequality and in wealth or income, they are a lagging variable. They change later than all the other variables. We could talk about what the other. Actually, I know. I'll tell you what the real turning point here is, the sort of mean turning point in all these graphs is 1964, which is the first year that I personally voted. So I have personally brought all of these catastrophes on America. One thing you notice about this is if you're 60 or older, you formed your impressions of American society in this part of the graph. But if you're 50 or younger, you formed, and especially if you're now in your 30s, you formed your impressions of American society in this part of the graph. Now, why did I go through all that? I'm trying to say, I don't know what causes that, but the way to describe it most simply is we, once upon a time, were a very unequal and uncommunitarian and unconnected society, low giving and few ties across class boundaries and so on. Then we became, over the course of the first two-thirds of the 20th century, more likely to be worried about other people, more concerned about equality, and more likely to connect with people across class lines. And so this is why I think that the period at the turn of the century is so important. Even though I don't know what caused this inflection point up here, we can look at this inflection point
and that's
down
what
here.
I'm hoping you will do. So.
Well, so let me just say a bit about if you don't know much about the Gilded Age progressive era in American society, that's the one thing you should carry away, is that's really important, because there are a lot of parallels between our plight in America today and the plight of America around 1900. Very high economic inequalities, very high immigration rates, very high political alienation and political corruption, many other parallels between that period and our period. Perhaps the most interesting is the public philosophy in that period, in the period of the Gilded Age, the first Gilded Age, was what was called social Darwinism. Social Darwinism was a pseudoscientific theory that the bottom line of which is America will be better off if we're all selfish. I'm not making that up, that's actually the theory. So it was a period in some respects like ours, a period in which you could imagine that nothing's going to change here. But then in a short period of time, about 10, 15, maybe 20 years, America began to recognize the problem and changed what we did, and that accounts for this inflection point back there. The first kind of inkling that Americans were beginning to catch on to this problem was a book that was published in 1890 by an American journalist, a Danish-American journalist in New York, called How the Other Half Lives. You've heard that book. It was basically a description of the squalor in the tenements of the Lower East Side, intended to be read in the silk stocking districts of the Upper East Side, and basically said to those folks, that's us, our counterparts then, look, do you see what life is like down there in the slums? And of course, some people in the Upper East Side said, that's fine, that's their problem. But enough people up there decided that's not the America I want to live in, that they began to change the politics around poverty in New York City, and that better sewers and better water and so on, and actually made a material difference in the life of these folks here. It would be wrong, and I don't want to say this, that our kids will have that same impact in America today, but that's the genre in which I'm writing. I'm trying to say to all of you, look how bad, not just with the data, but also the stories. Do you want your grandchildren to grow up in a world in which America has become so segregated and in which the degree of equality, the degree of success in life is so much inherited? So that's the first thing that I learned from that period. The second thing is that there was a national conversation about inequality at that period. That's the part you know. That's Jane Addams and Teddy Roosevelt and so on. But actually, the real innovations that turned the corner down here didn't come from Washington, didn't come from Cambridge, Mass. They came from small towns and cities all over America, like Bend. Actually, Bend was not one of the places then, but they came from Toledo and Galveston and Sacramento. The most important of the inventions that came at the grassroots level in that period, and this is directly relevant, is in small towns in Iowa and Kansas and Nebraska, Americans invented the high school. God did not invent the high school. For the first time in human history, people in the community agreed that they should tax themselves so that all the kids in town got a free public secondary education. Nowhere else in the world. That decision was the best decision America has ever made because, on the one hand, the increased human capital, the quality of our labor force meant that most of the economic historians say most of our economic growth in the 20th century came from that one decision because it boosted us way ahead of the rest of the world in terms of the quality of our labor force, and at the same time it leveled the playing field. So it was a really, really win-win situation. The sequence of change was that these local innovations, like the high school, spread rapidly. Eventually the news got to Washington, and eventually in the 1910 period, things like child labor laws and wage and hour laws and so on were passed, and that's the high progressive era. But the action, so this is the lesson I draw. I think it's got to come from ordinary people in ordinary towns across America.
And as a shorthand for an argument about craft and understanding the country that we'll have another time, that is exactly the development that Deb and I think we are chronicling right now, of people who are trying in Sioux Falls and Greenville and all these places.
That's wonderful.
Trying to do that.
I just don't think it's happened in Bend yet.
Well, I've published one goddamn piece on Bend. There are about 10 to come. It was about the community college. So stay tuned. Let me give you, I have one other question to ask you, then we'll turn it over to the, but look at our series on the Golden Triangle of Mississippi. That is the most deeply interesting and encouraging place because they live with the fact that they are in Mississippi. There's a guy there who brought a helicopter factory to the Golden Triangle of Mississippi. He said, "We're making shit that flies in Mississippi." We stand up a little taller, and we were talking with people who were living in double wides in the Delta and all that. So a specific question, then we'll turn it over to the audience in our remaining moments. You end your book with one very, very specific thing that you say, if you read this book, you want to make life better, here's a specific thing you should go do at your school. Can you explain what that is, and then 2 or 3 other sort of specifics of that sort?
I will, and I'm happy to have emphasized that, but it's not because I think that's the solution to all of America's problems.
Right, but you say, here's the first thing to do.
It's emblematic. So another one of the scissors graphs that I didn't tell you about before has to do with extracurricular activities. Extracurricular activities are taking part in extracurricular activities, bands, chorus, football, French club, and so on, is high and in some cases rising among kids coming from college-educated homes, but declining sharply among kids coming from high school-educated homes. And I sometimes get teased as if I were trying to say that high school football is the solution to all of America's problems. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is the hard evidence shows that taking part in extracurricular activities in fact increases what we now call soft skills. It increases ability to work in teams, delayed gratification, what my mom would have called stick-to-itiveness, grit, and so on. That's what the evidence shows, and that shouldn't be a surprise because high schools were invented and extracurricular activities were invented precisely to do that project. That is, the people who invented high schools also invented extracurricular activities because they knew those kids needed to learn not just reading, writing, arithmetic, and chemistry, but also that they needed to learn teamwork and grit and determination and delayed gratification and so on. And now what we've done, and for most of the 20th century, probably for the lives of most of the people in this room, everybody in town, everybody in high school had a chance to take part in those extracurricular activities. But beginning about 20 or 30 years ago in America, somebody across America, I'm leaving aside who did this, but in effect we did this, decided that extracurricular activities were a frill and that if you wanted to take part in extracurricular activities, your parents should pay for it. That institution, that change in public policy meant that, it's called pay to play, meant that since the average cost now nationwide in America for taking part in one semester of one extracurricular activity is $400, you have 2 kids in high school and they both want to do one activity the year round, that's 4 times $400 or $1,600. Now, for probably most of us in the room, $1,600 is trivial. Of course you'd pay $1,600 for your kid to be able to, play soccer or music or whatever. But if your annual income is $16,000, who in their right mind is going to spend 1/10 of their total family income on high school football? And so, but that's just economics 101. It should surprise nobody that the net effect of that change has been to drive this wedge and therefore drive working class kids out of the prospect of learning those soft skills. Though we know that those soft skills are really valuable. It's not just a fringe playing, because if we know employers will pay people more, the same person, if they've taken part in extracurricular activities because they have those soft skills. So that's the one of these graphs that illustrates how privatizing things that we used to think everybody in town ought to get has had disproportionate effects on poor folks. It's something, the reason I say close the book and get off your chair and go down to your high school and ask whether you have pay to play, and if you do, tell them that that's wrong, to stop it. And they will tell you, oh, but we have waivers for poor kids. And if they say that, they know nothing about adolescent society, because those waivers act as, in effect, a kind of a star on the head of a kid saying, my parents are too poor, and the kids all know it, and you can talk to kids, and they don't want the waiver, they just prefer to drop out of the sport. So that, I'm not saying we can save America by ending pay to play. I'm saying that illustrates the kind of thing that we could actually do ourselves in our own communities. There are big things we could do. My nominee for the high school of the 21st century is early childhood education. The evidence is so clear that high quality early childhood education is expensive but pays for itself and has especially powerful effects on poor kids. And the most comprehensive statewide program in America is in the reddest of states. Oklahoma has a really quite impressive early childhood education program. So there are the beginnings of these kinds of changes you've talked about. Not only early childhood education, I think community colleges, and now we're back on the same side of that issue. I say here that I think community colleges and other kinds of on-ramps like technical and professional linked education is another important part of the problem. There are lots of other things specifically, like mentoring. I can't avoid saying mentoring is an important part of the problem, is an important part of the solution. That can be done locally as well as nationally. I think more family-friendly policies, family leave and other family-friendly policies would make a big difference to single working-class moms. There are a lot of other things. I'm not going to try to list all of them there. There's some big things that'll take some time and political organizing to get. There's some smaller things we could do right now.
I will add one sentence. The biggest surprise about the American educational system, based on what we've seen now in 20-plus states over the last 2 years, is the revolution in career technical education, what used to be called vocational education. Just everywhere you can think of, in Georgia, in Vermont, in South Dakota, there are really, really interesting things going on there, a lot of emphasis. We have just a few minutes left. Who has a question? Yes, so are there microphones? So a microphone will come. Whoever the microphone first gets to can ask the question. And is there another microphone, too, that's moving around? Okay, so just go to somebody, then we'll call on next. Yes.
So, hi, my name's Tane Danger. It's an honor to talk to both of you. So I'm from Minnesota, and I actually went to college in a small town that you, Mr. Fallows, I think even wrote about, St. Peter. And one of the things that they have dealt with in a lot of places is this Bill Bishop idea of the big sort, and people are moving away from each other. And that's the piece that I try to wrap my head around. Everybody is moving to places where they feel comfortable, and it's a self-reinforcing thing because you see less and less of people who are different than you, which makes you more and more fearful of people who are less like you, which makes you less and less likely to live with them. And I don't think we're going to move back to company town, so what changes that?
Well, I like Bill Bishop's theory. He's phrasing it mostly in terms of partisanship, and he's right about that, and that drives a lot of the problems we're talking about. It isn't just, if we talk about the housing, residential segregation more generally, it's not just that everybody's moving to places that they want to live. Some of us are able to move to places we want to live, and other people are simply not able to move to places where they'd like to live, so they're stuck together. They don't want to live there either, but they're stuck there for a variety of historical reasons that we could talk about in greater length. So we've got to be, always in this area, in this whole area, we've got to be careful about national generalizations that actually are insensitive, I don't mean you are, but are insensitive to the fact that we're living in a two-tier society now. So what can be done about the segregation you're talking about? Obviously, we're not going to tell people where they have to live. We could, since our public policies were responsible for a lot of the segregation that we have now, some of those public policies we could change, and that would change the incentives for people to flee from people unlike them. There are ways that if we can't move the people, we can think about moving their kids, so giving kids in poor neighborhoods a chance to go to school in rich neighborhoods is another option. If we can't move either the parents because of opposition to telling people where to live, and we can't move the kids because of opposition to quote busing unquote, then we've got to think about moving the money so that we overinvest in the schools that are in poor neighborhoods, and equalizing the money between those two is not enough, because the problems that are located in these poor neighborhoods and poor schools are way worse than the problems that are located in the upper class schools. So something has got to change. Either we figure out a way to reverse this centrifugal flight away from people of other social classes, or we've got to think about ways to increase class integration in schools, or we've got to do a lot more compensation for the effects of that change on poor kids.
So we've got 5 minutes left. Let's see if we can have another question or two. Yes.
Has the decline of union jobs played any part in this?
One of the other graphs that I didn't show, but that has exactly the same form as union membership, I should have included that, and it's certainly related to this. The larger question of why there has been stagnation in working class wages, especially wages of working class men, for 30 or 40 years, is a big, important problem. I'm not an economist. I can say that from the point of view of the things I'm concerned about, which is kids, solving that problem, that is reversing that trend toward no jobs and low wages for the bottom half or third of the economy, that should be a high priority. I don't have myself any particular expertise that allows me to say what's the right solution to that, whether it's earned income tax credit, or whether it's more job training, or whether it's minimum wage or whatever. Those are all policies that, and this fits with your story, increasingly are being tried around the country, even the minimum wage. So yes, I think there is a connection between what's happened to the working class and this problem I'm concerned about.
Yes.
Thank you. Happy Haynes from Denver, Colorado, and we just hosted you in Denver.
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you for being there. You talked about the sort of first revolution, if you will, of free public education in the early part of the century. The president recently made a proposal, and there are a number of cities around the country now looking at the idea of free community college.
Right.
Is that the next sort of revolution in education that could make a difference?
Before you answer that, I'm going to see if we can have the other question be asked too, and you can answer them
Sure.
both. Yeah.
Thanks.
Yes.
Hey. Hi, I'm Sarah Holbrook. I run a STEM nonprofit in rural southwestern Colorado. We do after-school programming and also in-school programming as well. We find that the minorities and even some of the girls don't participate unless we segregate them out and do things on their own, and then hopefully bring them back into our programming. And I just wonder if that means that they're not our kids, if we're not bringing them all together.
So free community college and segregation of people for their own good in these early
Do you mean
programs.
segregation by social class, or do you mean segregation by gender? Maybe I misheard.
It happens that I do both. I do a robotics kit for the Hispanic kids. Most of them are boys, some of them are girls, and I do a
Yeah, but I don't have a view.
And you have 2 minutes for both these topics.
I don't have a view about when gender segregation works educationally and when it doesn't. I do think that class segregation is almost always bad. I do think it's bad to have a working class football team at the high school and an upper middle class football team at the high school. On the issue of community colleges, we both talked about the fact that I think improving access to community colleges is really important. But actually, I don't think that the most important problem is getting people in the door. I think it's getting people through the community college. And that isn't just about tuition. That's about providing a ton more social support. The kids in Bend that we interviewed who wanted to go to the great community college there and didn't, wasn't because of the lack of money. It was because they have lived such unbelievably turbulent lives with no trustworthy adults in their life that trying to make their way through the maze of community colleges. I'm not picking on this community college. I'm talking about all community colleges. It's a maze.
And for the record, it's Central Oregon Community College, COCC. You can look it up. So with that, please join me in thanking Robert Putnam.